Hi, I'm Corrine, and today we're going to paint these abstract flowers on Grafix Dura-Bright White. I'm going to start with some blending solution in this little bottle and just draw 5 lines of blending solution down the page. Next, I'll take Ranger Meadow inks and just nozzle paint a line of ink on top of the blending solution. And I'm going to let that spread on its own. I'll lay it down, and then I'll take a paintbrush with either blending solution or 91% alcohol, and I'm going to move it through the green lines of the stems and just widen them up a little bit. And then I'll let the ink flow on its own again. I'll pick up the paper and let the inks flow down the page a little bit. And you can see it's still wet because the paper is still shiny. And I'll just take a Q-tip and just wipe off the ink off the bottom of that page. And then lay it down and let it continue to dry. And I want the stems dry before I do the next step. Now I'm taking the meadow ink again, and I'm just putting a little dot of ink directly from the nozzle of the bottle onto the page. I'm using an odd number because an odd number is more pleasing to the eye. These will then become very abstract leaves or petals. I'm placing some blending solution in the middle, 1 drop, and then using the straw of the canned air directly over the middle of the circle. I'm giving a short puff, as you can see, of the canned air to move the inks out. And every time I do this, the ink will move differently and create different patterns. I'm not crazy about how that one circle came out square, kind of square on the end. And so I've removed a little bit of the ink. I'll take a little bit more meadow ink and place it down, a little bit of blending solution, and a puff of canned air, and let that ink move. So it's important when you use the canned air to just give a small puff and let the ink move back into the center of the area by itself. I want to speed up the drying time, so I'm using a heat tool on low and just drying the ink before I start the next layer. I've decided I want these green petals to be darker, and so now I'm taking the ink with no blending solution, just straight ink, and the canned air, just a little puff, and creating another layer of petals over the first. Again, using my heat tool, I'll just dry this layer of petals before going on to the next. For my main flowers, I'm going to be using Ranger Ink's Eggplant for my dark purple and Purple Twilight for the lighter. I'm going to take some eggplant and put it down with the nozzle, and you can see I'm just giving it a short burst of air to move the ink. At this point, I haven't used any blending solution. I like when I give the burst of air that the ink will move out of the way, and as you can see from some of these, the paper moves back to white, so this paper doesn't stain, which is really great when we're doing this type of art. So I'm taking a look at where do I want some more eggplant and just adding another layer of petals. The burst of air is very soft, and it's important to allow the ink to move after you give it the little burst of air. I'm not trying to dry the ink at all with the air. And as long as that ink is wet, I can continue to give it small puffs of air and move it. I want to make sure this layer is dry before I start the next, so I'll use my Hue tool on a low setting once again. Building up this abstract bouquet of flowers, I'll go to my lightest color now, which is Purple Twilight. A drop of that, a drop of blending solution. I'm letting it spread a little bit before I give it that little puff of air. I'm looking around the painting and adding this ink in white spaces between other areas, letting it spread, adding the blending solution, let it spread some more, give it the puff of air, and what happens as the ink starts to pull back into the middle of the flower, it pulls some of the color from the flowers around it. So now we get some texture and depth in those petals that we didn't see in some of the underlying petals. And so this one's gonna pull some of that green back into that pink and give us that look of an overlap. So I like how the green is pulling in, so I'm going to do this again between the green and the eggplant and give it a puff. Now, not every petal may come out in a shape that we want it, but if we just watch it and let it dry and see how the ink pulls in, it becomes very interesting. So with this layer of ink, I'm letting the composition tell me what to do versus me telling it what to do. And so we're watching the ink to see where is it going. The other thing you can see is that let's work around the paper and make sure we don't work wet into wet, otherwise we won't be able to maintain our shapes. So now I'm adding some smaller drops of ink and using the canned air without the blendings, the inks without the blending solution to create another layer. I've got this one spot where there's too much Purple Twilight, and I'm going to add a little bit of eggplant and just puff that gently. I'm going to add it in another spot too, so I can get a little bit more depth in this painting. And now I'm back to my Purple Twilight. So the nice thing about this type of painting is great for beginners and beyond. As long as you learn how to control that can of air, you can make a pretty little abstract painting pretty quickly. And the inks move really well on this paper. So now I have spots where I can see that I need more light in the painting, and I'm going to add a drop of blending solution. Let that ink move back a little bit and just give a little puff of air right in the center. And as you can see, we go right back to white in the center. But this adds even another layer of petals to the painting. And I'm going around and looking for areas where either the colors overlap or I just have too much darkness. And I want to make sure I don't have a straight line anywhere, like across the bottom. Here I'm adding a little bit more ink. Just looking at what shapes the ink's making as it pushes out and pulls the other colors towards the center. Want a little bit more light in this area. And I want to break up this area a little bit. I'm going to come right in between these colors and try to get some of those colors to pull back into the petals. And I'm going to do the same thing over here where the colors overlap. And the fun thing about these types of paintings is as long as you pick analogous colors, so analogous colors are on the same side of the color wheel, and I've chosen 2 different purples, and then that green is on the opposite side of the color wheel. So you do have to be a little bit careful that you don't end up with brown mud when they combine. But you could continue to just continue to add layers and layers and layers of petals. Right now I am drawing around that because it spread further than I wanted. If you did these, this is on an 8x10 piece of Grafix Dura-Bright White, but if you did it on, say, 5x7s, they make wonderful little greeting cards. And again, as I mentioned before, any analogous colors will work, because then with the overlaps, you don't have to worry too much about creating mud. So you could do this with blues or your reds or yellows and oranges, and add a nice coordinating and complementary color green, and just have fun creating. Every time I do these, they turn out different. Which is also fun. Although I think the purple is probably my favorite color. I've done them in blue as well. So you can see I just keep going around the page, putting down some blending solution, letting the ink spread, and then giving it that soft puff of air. So I can just continue to add layers and layers and layers. Which is fun. But I think at this point I'm going to stop and evaluate where I am. Now I do think I want to add some smaller touches of color. And so I'm using paint off of my paintbrush from my palette and filling in some of these holes because I thought too much lights. And I just wanted to add some smaller petals. Now I could have left this well enough alone at the last step. And again, I'm working with the purple twilight. So if you want smaller petals, use less ink, drops of ink off of different size brushes, which will make different size petals. And I'm just looking at where do I want to have a few more petals. And I want different shapes down at the bottom. Okay, I think I'm finally done. It's interesting if you look closely how some of the blue is coming out of the inks in certain areas of the painting, which is also fun. So I mentioned I've painted this a couple times before, and as you'll note, every single one comes out different. And I actually think my favorite one out of the 3 that I've painted is this one here on the left. So I really hope that you've enjoyed this demonstration as part of the Alcohol Ink Art Community's demonstration of using Grafix Arts products. Happy inking!
Come learn, create, and share with us. It's a life-changing opportunity. Excite the artist within.